So Genesis 39, a little bit shorter of a chapter. I don't know if that means we'll finish earlier or not, but we had a little bit of an interlude last week as we began into Joseph's life, and then it jumped right back out of Joseph's life for kind of a rather difficult chapter. But we survived it, we learned a little, and moving on. But we're back into Joseph's life. He'd been betrayed by his brothers, thrown in a pit, pulled out of the pit, sold, now is on his way about to land in Egypt. The Egypt of this day, the Egypt that Joseph would have went into, had about 2,000 different deities that they worshipped at the time. Pharaoh happened to be one of them. They were a pretty sharp crew. I forgot the reference, but I know a number of months ago when we were teaching through kind of the knowledge of some of the ancient world, it was interesting. They recently found an artifact that really predates when they thought many of the understandings of geometry had really come into light, and how much these guys really knew is still pretty impressive. Their knowledge of the stars led them to a 365-day and 1/4 day calendar, which is essentially what we have, if you count the leap year. They had a great knowledge of embalming and preserving people, bodies. Their pyramids, they would have one stone cut with, they had a number of stones, but some stones, for example, would be cut with such precision and placed perfectly, and they would be upwards of 15 tons. And there was no caterpillar equipment in those days. So they were pretty ingenuitive, pretty sharp guys. The nation of Egypt knew the art of war really well. So this was kind of the day and age in which Joseph entered Egypt. They were already pretty much the significant nation of their time. And so as he comes in, he's going to have a continued time of both testing and exaltation. And so in this chapter, I was just really thinking about, is character more important than reputation? To me, to us, to our society. Is character more important than our reputation? Because Joseph is going to have amazing character through the whole thing, but not always an amazing reputation. Because godliness with contentment is great gain. But this serves as a reminder that great gain is not always contentment. And interesting, with all the advancements and all that Egypt was during their time, their greatest blessing, their greatest asset that the Egyptian world had at this time just rolled in as a Hebrew slave. What would deliver them and save them when their technology, when their money, when their pyramids, when their great achievements could not. This young man at 17 years old, with God working in him, would be their greatest asset within a handful of years. Verse 1. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. So we remember the story. Joseph's brothers had sold him. Hey, don't kill him, we can make a buck. So they sold him. And he winds up down now, and he gets purchased by Potiphar. Potiphar, his name doesn't seem to really have too much significance in this chapter, but I'll give it to you anyways. It essentially means devoted to the sun, the S-U-N, which probably was connected to their religion. He was an officer of Pharaoh. Now that word could be, and oftentimes is translated, eunuch. Now whether or not Potiphar was or was not, the Bible really doesn't say. Because this title and this word was used so much that oftentimes, well, I shouldn't say oftentimes, it was on occasion that this servant, this eunuch, was not always a man who had been castrated, but could have been. We don't know. Maybe that's part of the reason why that maybe after he had got married, he became so devoted. And because oftentimes kings and pharaohs, if you were going to be really close to them or close to important ladies or just high in power, it was something that they would do to make sure that it would help to guard against them wanting to take power or doing things. So it was a common practice, but we don't know if that was actually the case with Potiphar or not. The captain of the guard, essentially he was the chief of police, the secret service, kind of a real literal way you could take it, but he was essentially the executor, the butcher, if you will, the one who took care of problems. He was the head of those guys. Potiphar was the man not to be crossed. So this is the guy that bought Joseph and brought him into his home. In verse 2, when it says, and Joseph was a successful man. It's interesting, the Believer's Bible commentary pointed out that Tyndale, when he translated it, successful man, he actually translated it, he was a lucky fellow, which just kind of made me laugh, you know. You lucky dog, how you always wind up with all these things always working out. But he was a man who, you know, for the lack of better cliches, when he gave him lemons, he made lemonade. It just worked out for him, and it was obvious, and he saw it. But this successful, it's the same idea, the same wording as Joshua 1:8. When you meditate on God's word, when you're thinking on it and it's in your mouth day and night, you will have good success. It's the same idea that if God's word is in your mind, in your heart, in your mouth, God will make a way. God will be with you. You will have good success. It's also the same one as for Psalm 1, for the blessed man. But Joshua 1:8 is a good one for, there's a number of verses oftentimes that I'll share with people that I'll be just working with or talking to, and Joshua 1:8 is one of them for reasons why we memorize the word. Psalm 119, 9 through 11 is another one for how does a young man keep his way, how do you keep from sinning? By hiding your word in the heart. But also for success in serving the Lord no matter where you are, Joshua 1:8 is a good one. So the same kind of thing, and Joseph, his faith, but not just his faith, just the Lord in his life. He was with him, and he has good success. One other historical note that may or may not be worthy or noteworthy, I guess, is we'll see repeatedly that it notes that Potiphar was an Egyptian. Well, you'd think, well, duh, he got brought into Egypt. He's probably an Egyptian. But in the Genesis record, Dr. Henry Morris, he throws out there was actually a group of Semitic tribes, and I'm forgetting the name of it now, I should have wrote it in my notes, that had taken over part of Egypt for a time, because there was kind of a northern and southern around Joseph's time. And, of course, the Jews being descendants also of the Semitic tribes, maybe one of the reasons why he's noting here that specifically he was an Egyptian, and why maybe there was a little easier road for a Jew to become number two in the nation, and that when they were later historically expelled out that's why there was a Pharaoh that no longer knew Joseph, because they got rid of the Semitic tribes who had invaded and had ruled in part of Egypt for a time and went back to just when the Egyptians ruled again. I don't know. It was kind of interesting, worth passing on. That could be why things transitioned and worked out well in the rising up of Joseph, and could be possibly a historical explanation of what God used for when he was on the way out and Egypt took such a quick turn on or one of the reasons why it took such a quick turn on Israel. Anyways, enough history. Verse 3. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made him prosper, made all he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. Then he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had he put under his authority. So it was from that time he had made him overseer of his house, and all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had, and the house, and in the house and in the field. Joseph, pretty blessed. The guy begins to climb the ladder, if you will. It was interesting. John Corson had told a story way back when about a dad who had his kids trying to play baseball. Well, he didn't make the team. And this was down in Phoenix, Arizona, I believe. And so he decided, man, my kid's brokenhearted. What am I going to do? So he got together with all the coaches and he said, well, I'll take all the kids who didn't make the team, and I'll just make another team, and they'll all get to play, and everybody will be all right. Well, he took that team of kids who didn't make the cut, and they played in their last game. They won 19-0, and it was actually the league championship. He took that team, and they won the entire league and won handily of those who were who didn't make the team. That's kind of the story of Joseph's life. He gets kind of kicked out, and now he's on top, taking the show. Joseph displayed the reality of God. Pharaoh noticed that there in verse 3 that the Lord made him to prosper in everything that he did. It was known. He displayed God in his trust, in his diligence, and in the blessing they received from the Lord. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11 through 17, it talks a lot about submitting yourself into these situations, giving yourself wholehearted to them. And Joseph lived it long before it was penned. In this process in which he was raised up and walked this out was not a quick process. We know that Joseph was taken into slavery at approximately 17 years old. He would stand before Pharaoh and become second in the kingdom at about 30. We also know that he spent 2 years in prison. So, give or take about 11 years he was in Potiphar's house. So it probably didn't take all 11, but it probably took years for Joseph to reach this point, for to have these things work out in his life. We are in a culture, and I suppose it's always been part of us, being human, but just wanting these things instant. We're willing to humble ourselves in a tough situation under the hand of God for a week, maybe. That's a little long. We'd prefer maybe an afternoon. But Joseph would have came in there, probably had to first work with animals or something in the lowly end, which he could do that. He came from a family who could multiply animals quickly. He knew how to be blessed with animals. But regardless, By the end, he's running everything that Potiphar has. Potiphar doesn't even know how much land he has, how much money he has in the bank. Everything was in Joseph's hands. The only thing it says that Potiphar knew was the food that was placed in front of him. So Joseph, it would seem, would have had to learn a whole new language, all new customs of how Egyptians did things and didn't do things. He would have to learn practices and new business. He would have to learn a lot of different things, late nights, hard work. He would have to be out doing it and working hard at it for it to be visibly noticed. But God noticed. Proverbs is clear that God sees those things. He sees both the good and the evil. And God was with him and noticed and pointed it out. To me, it was a good reminder of an elder. You know, in 1 Timothy 3, talks about the qualifications of an elder. And oftentimes as I read, some of the tough words about what it's like to be in this world, or the world's going to hate you, etc., etc. But yet, an elder is to have a good report among those who are on the outside. And I think Joseph was a good example of that. That you can be godly, you can be moral, you can work hard, you can serve the Lord, and even those who disagree with you, who may not even like you, will know. They'll know what kind of person you are. They will know that God is with you. So it was just a good testimony to me that it could be done. So he had a lot of hard work, and many years went into God promoting him in this. And God often does. He will test those before he promotes. He will give you little things that are doable, accomplishable, not always easy. And then you got to do those. You got to walk them out. You got to live them out. And then God will exalt you in his time. Peter says, humble yourself under the mighty hand of God, and he will exalt you in due time. It's a fact. And Joseph was living this out. Verse 6. Thus he left all that he had in Joseph's hands, and he did not know what he had except for the bread which he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance, which is almost the same wording as to describe his mom. So very well may have been a looker like his mom. Not really sure, but if he looked exactly like his mom, but he was definitely a good-looking guy from head to toe. Bible only talks about two other guys like that. And I believe it was David and Absalom and Joseph here. Good-looking guys. Verse 7, and it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph, and she said, lie with me. So Joseph's life was a bit of a roller coaster. He went from the house where he was blessed, hanging out with his dad, probably learned a lot of these business principles, a lot of these things that are now coming to pass in Egypt. So probably he probably went back and thanked his dad later for the time spent with him in the house when he was just the man in the fancy coat. But now he went from that to the pit, and then back to a servant, now being elevated, and now back to a hard place. In fact, Proverbs would say to be careful for this style of lady. It is a pit. So it comes to more of a figurative pit here rather than a literal. But kind of a lot of up and downs for Joseph. So she cast longing eyes on this good-looking young man. But he refused, verse 8, and said to his master's wife, look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all things to my hand. There is no one greater in the house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? So Joseph gives really a great response. He had been given everything in the home. He had access to the money, the food, the everything, except for his wife. And so, as she comes to him, and it's interesting that Potiphar's wife is never named. And I think that's probably, the Lord maybe give that a little bit so that we can maybe relate just a little bit. Because all of us are going to have, or currently do have, maybe even at the very moment, something that's going to cast its eyes for you. That says, hey, come on over for a minute. Just come spend some time with me. We all have that temptation in our life. One, it may be gambling. One, it may be pornography. And one, it may be whatever. But it's going to come. And Joseph here begins to give us a good pattern for how to deal with temptation, how to deal with the Potiphar's wife, or so to speak, in our life. First off, Joseph's faith was known. If we're going to be in tough situations, or we're going to have spots where we're going to be tempted, it's a real good safeguard in that situation, for our faith to be known. Whether it's because you got your Jesus shirt on, or it's because you're talking about the Lord, or because you're doing something for Him, or that it's known that God's in your life and blessing you, to be outwardly and openly sinning, it does bring a certain amount of accountability that you're a servant of the Lord. So Joseph's faith was known. So that was first off. And it seems also here that Joseph had a real good, a high esteem of marriage. Despite all their family problems, adultery was not something really that was in his family. But he specifically points out, you are his wife, and I cannot do this great wickedness. It was a great wickedness to him to be with somebody's wife. So, and I don't know if there are very many examples. Perhaps there is one out there that someone could find because of grace, but there are very few examples, at least, that where you have a solid believer who chooses to commit adultery, whether they're the married party or not, and has a solid walk with the Lord afterwards. There's forgiveness, absolutely, but most people walk with a limp at best. Most people's walks don't recover from a wickedness like this. And so I really appreciate just Joseph drawing the attention first that, man, you're married. It's just wicked. So one, his faith was known. Good way to avoid temptation. Two, he called it for what it is. He didn't say, well, adultery is it's kind of a cry for help in a marriage. No, they're just weak. No, he calls it sin. He doesn't dance around, whatever, anger. It's just a matter of self-expression or trying to put all the fancy titles that we have on it today. Joseph said, this is sin. How can I sin against God? So we make our faith known, and we call sin out when it's there. Ephesians 5:11 says, don't partake in the deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. So when our faith is known and we're calling sin for sin, those are two also great ways to help us protect what is ultimately God's from sinning. So again, he brings God up in also. That'd be a third principle. It'll be a handful. I could probably do a better job of condensing. I'm trying to learn how to make lists. It's a work in progress. But the third one here, he brings up God. Not only sin, but it's sin against God. John Corson had a cute little saying. He says, one thing that helps you to avoid temptation and to walk righteously is to remember The awareness of the there-ness of God. Doesn't that sound very Corsony? The awareness of the there-ness of God. God is there. Not only that it's sin against him, but that he is there. He has books with all of our deeds. I hope those don't get opened. Just stamp Jesus on mine, thanks. But remembering our relationship with God, the reality of that he's there and he is with us, and ultimately, at the end of the day, all sin is against him. Proverbs 15:3. He is aware and he is there. He is with it and he witnesses both good deeds and the bad. Verse 10. So it was as she spoke to Joseph day by day that he did not heed her to lie with her or to be with her. Which brings up number 4. Be careful with your idle time. Joseph was a guy who stayed busy. He didn't stop to smell the roses with her, to hang out, to have coffee. Didn't entertain it. Which kind of goes hand in hand with number 5. Distance brings safety with sin, especially in relationships with people that you shouldn't, and improper relationships with those that you should not have. Distance brings safety. It doesn't matter who you are or what your strength was. Joseph was a guy who God worked in and super cool, this great example. Probably had no idea that somebody was going to write all this down and be looking at his personal life for thousands and thousands of years. I don't know how that would have affected it. It would affect me on how I acted, but maybe not Joseph. But distance brings safety. Not only did he say, well, I should try to keep peace in the house. She's somebody I got to be around every day. Maybe, I'll just grab a cup of coffee with her, what have you, from time to time. We'll just, we'll have some okay rules or whatever, but, they didn't even entertain any ideas of, as it says.
Apologies, I don't understand.
No, you wouldn't, Siri. She just doesn't get it. You got to have some distance from your technology, apparently, too. But distance brings safety. So that's another principle in temptation. For me, one probably, I guess not too personal of an example, but for myself, quitting chewing was something that was probably one of the hardest things that I've ever done. Thanks to the grace of God. But I knew through the process of that, there was something I couldn't personally touch again, or I would do it and probably never quit again. And so when it came to working around guys with it, or having those desires, you drive by the store, you just didn't stop. Because if you didn't maintain that distance, if you didn't maintain that buffer between just giving in a little, just having one, what have you, it'd have been all over. So maintaining that distance, that boundary. He didn't take the time at the end of verse 10 to be with her in the presence of, or to lie with her and to sin with her. Verse 11. But it happened about this time when Joseph went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was inside, that she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. And so it was, when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled outside, that she called to the men of her house and spoke to them, saying, he has brought to us a Hebrew to mock us. He came in to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And it happened when he heard that I lifted my voice and cried out, that he left his garment with me, and he fled and went outside. So it seems that she would have maybe organized the situation where it was just her and him. So she had the setup going on, and he comes a strolling in to do his normal housework and business, and she said, jumps out and aha, gotcha. Grabs a hold of his coat, and it probably would have been an interesting scene to watch. I can't imagine that maybe he just slipped right out of it easy, but it may have been quite a scene also to see her grab a hold of let's say a 20-something, 23, 24-year-old guy and get his coat off. He might have been wrestling and working on fleeing for his life at the moment, which maybe he was thinking about that because adultery in that culture would have been something that you could have been executed for. So perhaps not only just to be pure before the Lord, but maybe he was getting ready to run for his life. No good way out of it at this point for Joseph, or at least doesn't seem to see how this situation could be redeemed or salvaged. But a stand for personal purity, marriage, and a relationship with God, and the trust, even the trust that was given to him, was all at stake here. It was all on the line. But he was willing to take a stand no matter what the consequences were. He wasn't going to give in. He wasn't going to be given to lying or having misplaced trust put in him. He wasn't going to sacrifice his relationship with God, nor his purity, nor the marriage. And so he takes off. He takes off. 2 Timothy 2:22. Flee youthful lusts. Now, Paul doesn't say only to youth, flee youthful lusts, though Timothy, we oftentimes look at young, though he was probably more around 40 at the time. But I think that's wisdom for anyone at any age, whether you're a youth or not. Flee youthful lusts. So another principle, 6, if you will. Flee. We can resist the devil, but we are to flee temptation. Because no temptation has overtaken you except for such as common to mankind. It will. It'll get you. Whatever it is in your life, if you give it room, if you let it close, if you don't think you're strong enough to stand, you are not. God says, but with those temptations, He's also made the way of escape, that you're able to bear it. You got to take the exit door when temptation comes. When the Potiphar's wife, if you will, in your life comes, grabs a hold of you, or you find yourself in this situation that you didn't plan for, or you couldn't make provision to get out of, comes and grabs a hold of you. God says your way of escape is to flee. Us in the flesh, we're not capable. So Joseph does as God instructs. Only later, again, he's doing it before it was penned. He flees. Don't linger. That was always a good piece of advice. It was an older gentleman who was an elder out in Camas Valley there. And got to spend a lot of time with him. And just, a guy who just had some good practical stuff from time to time. And we were talking about, looking a little too long. And he said, you just remember, you don't, especially with your eyes, don't linger. You're going to see a lot of things are going to come across your path, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, but to be tempted is not sin. But don't linger. Take the escape now. Don't linger. Flee temptation, take the way of escape. Because so we make our faith known, we call sin, we keep distance. I'll have to go back, turn the page and review. Flee temptation. But another point, I'll have two more. Number 7 is everyday determination. Joseph didn't just happen to have the strength one day. I guarantee every day Joseph was on his knees and said, Lord, help me not to sin against you. Help me to not walk in this great wickedness. Because every day he had determined not to be alone with Potiphar's wife. He had to determine every day not to be drawn in by her invitation to a young man who had the means and the opportunity and probably the drive within himself to commit it. Everyday determination. Take up your cross every day for those things that we really struggle with in life, whatever it may be for you. Every day. It's every day. We got to determine to give ourselves wholly to the Lord. That if we come into that situation, if we're dying of hunger and we're just creeping past 7 feathers and we're trying to get out of gambling, just, every day you got to determine, no, I'm not going to stop. Even if I got to go eat at Burger King across the street. Not going to stop. Every day for the plague of pornography, men and women got to get up and say, no, I'm not going to do that. I don't care if it pops up on my screen or not. If it comes and grabs me by the sleeve and by the coat, and it's right there, and I have a job, I've got to be on the computer, but it comes up anyways. Man, I'm gonna shut it down. I'm gonna flee the situation. If it has, I'll have to. I'll quit my job or I'll do something else. Everyday determination that if that temptation comes into your life, I'm not gonna do it. None of it is worth you, Lord. None of it's worth trading my purity or my marriage or my relationship with God or the trust that's been given to me by others or what have you. Because make no mistake, sin will make you a liar. All the time. It'll make you a liar. Finally, kind of one other point that I think is noteworthy when dealing with temptation to keep us solid is expect accusation. Here, how quickly lust turned to anger. And how quickly it does. Here we have the example with a woman. In 2 Samuel 13, we have an example with a man, with Ammon and Tamar, when he had to have her, had her, and then got freaked out and angry. Here, she had to have him, didn't work out. She freaks out and gets angry. So expect accusations as you take a stand for the Lord. If not by people, by the enemy, by Satan. He is the accuser of the brethren. And if we allow ourselves to get worn down in our determination, our zeal for the Lord with guilt or condemnation. Now God gives conviction, but those who are in Christ, there is no more condemnation. It's not from Him. We have convictions, other such things. The Lord will remind us. He'll speak to us. But the accuser of the brethren will also get you down on your failure. Maybe I shouldn't have been there. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. Maybe I shouldn't have... Whatever. I guess I'll speak a little bit more to some guys or to some men that thought or that person, whatever, will come into your mind. At that moment of temptation, it's not sin. Our Lord was tempted at every way that you and I are, yet without sin. James lines it out a little more clearly in chapter 1 also of his book, that what we do with the temptation is everything. To be tempted is not. It eventually, if we give way to temptation, if we give into it, it will, in its maturity, become sin and death. But at that moment, it's not. And oftentimes when we have those thoughts or we'll have those struggles, we'll want to get down on ourselves. God, why can't I beat this struggle? God, where did that even come from in my mind? Paul says to to cast down those arguments. Get them out. Ask the Lord for help. But our enemy will try to win a battle in your mind as well. You dirty, rotten sinner. You've already lost. You've already this, you've already that. And sometimes we'll give in to the accusations. Sometimes we'll linger on them too long. And it will also bring weakness to our walk. But some good stuff in Joseph here. Though he is having a difficult time, he gives us an excellent pattern for temptation. Gives us a good insight on Christ, which we'll, in a few chapters, we'll do a little bit of a review on how Joseph really shows us Jesus. Verse 14. Sorry, I already went through that. Verse 19. So it was, when his master heard the words which his wife spoke to him, saying, Your servant did to me after this manner, that his anger was aroused. Then Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. So she lets her fury out, heads to her husband, shows him the evidence of the coat. And I love there in before how it says, he brought this Hebrew in to mock us. Isn't it interesting when the heat's on and all this goes on, how we'll bring up those differences or we'll throw out some accusation. If you need any living examples of that, turn on the news. Why someone didn't win the election? Well, it's because he's this. Or why this happened? Well, it's because they're that. Whether it's whatever. I don't even really want to bring any of them up, but just turn on the news and you'll see that this really happens because of whatever, white privilege, or this really happens because they're this phobic, or he brought this Hebrew in. Always brings out the best in us to mock us. So it doesn't say where his anger was directed towards. And so a lot of people will say, and I happen to probably agree, that it probably wasn't necessarily towards Joseph. He maybe didn't. Granted, it's just interpretation. So take it for what it's worth, but he probably knew something was up. Because he had the power and the right to execute him. But he doesn't. And he doesn't even throw him in the common prison. He throws him in a particular prison. So, again, take it for what it's worth. He definitely had a liking for Joseph, and whether or not he believed his wife or not, he had to do something about it. So at the very least, he threw him in prison, would appear for life imprisonment, but not execution. Verse 21. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy. And he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did there, it was in his doing. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it to prosper. Another good testimony for Joseph. That he wasn't necessarily under his circumstances. He was really above his circumstances. And it's kind of interesting. I was always, my wife used to get bothered by it from time to time. We'd be talking to somebody, oh, well, yeah, I'm still just working at the mill or whatever. Always just kind of under the circumstance. And I remember listening to sometimes moms or something, well, yeah, I'm just a stay-at-home mom. I don't think Joseph lived that way. Well, I'm just a slave. I'm just in prison. But no matter where he was, everything that he did with all of his might unto the Lord. Everything. And every time the Lord would have mercy on him or raise him up to lift him up. We have a little bit of time, so I want to look at 1 Peter chapter 2. I think it's an interesting commentary on this type of situation. 1 Peter chapter 2, and I'll read 17 through 18. 18 through 25. 1 Peter chapter 2, beginning in verse 18. We'll probably go all the way to 25. Servants, be submissive to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the harsh. Certainly fits in this situation. For this is commendable, if because of conscience towards God one endures grief, suffering wrongly. For what credit is it if when you are beaten for your faults, you take it patiently? But when you do good and suffer, if you take it patiently, it is commendable before God. For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example, that you should follow his steps. Who committed no sin, nor was deceit found in his mouth. Who, when he was reviled, did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but committed himself to him who judges righteously. Who himself bore our sins in his own body on the tree, that we, having died to sins, might live for righteousness, by whose stripes you were healed. For you were like sheep going astray, but have now returned to the shepherd and the overseer of your souls. So Christ leaving us an example. And I think this is probably one of the greatest lived out examples, apart from Jesus, of someone who didn't revile, didn't threaten return, took the harsh things from his master, submitted regardless, because he had committed his way to God. That really blessed me when I read that through 1 Peter. And not only that those things happened, but also that we have Jesus as an example of the same. Of this life of complete trust in the Lord. And it didn't waver his work ethic. It didn't waver his purity or his commitment or trust in God. I'm sure he had some tearful nights. I don't think being human or having emotion takes away from that. But here we find Joseph taken away in chains again. And he's still trusting in the Lord. In verse 2 of this chapter, the Lord was with Joseph. Verse 3, his master saw it, and his whole house was blessed by it, noted in verse 5. And here in 23, the Lord is with him again. What a roller coaster of a life. And in less than 2 years from now, he's going to be over Potiphar and his wife. I wonder how that first conversation went. As Joseph will soon be the second in the whole country. How's it going, Potiphar? You're now under my authority. I'm sure Joseph was more honorable than I would have been. But in 2 years, in a short time, the Lord would raise him up to be arguably the second most powerful man in the world. But he just had to resist sin. He had to be faithful in something that we wouldn't consider a great thing. Just being a slave. Not being tempted to sin. Being righteous, working hard. So all of these things are tools in which God trains his leaders, because we're often tested before we are promoted. Well, Joseph also gives us a reminder that not every man has a price. Not every woman has a price. Some people can't be bought. And we have that example in Joseph and Jesus, Job, Paul, just to name some of them. Because Joseph was not given a spirit of fear, but of self-control. Samson had great ability, but no self-control. His life ended in a pile of rubble. Joseph started out with not much authority, not much power, but God was with him, and he winds up standing before kings. God used his mistreatment as character building. He would learn to wait on the Lord as well. Not just to be able to suffer him, but also to wait on him. Another quality we are in desperate need of. Not just to be able to wait, but to be able to wait well on the Lord. I know I don't do that very well. I've grown up with microwaves, and we haven't even had to walk to the TV to change the channel. Well, maybe when I was real little, but. You guys remember, oh man, in my house, you had to open up the window, and one of us would go outside, and turn the antenna, and the other one would yell, "Wait, stop right there! Got a good picture." Now it's all satellite or over the internet now. I don't think I'd have the patience to do that anyway. I wouldn't even watch TV. Don't even bother changing the channel. I'm not turning that stupid antenna. But to learn to wait on the Lord, patience, faithfulness, the fruit of the Spirit just abounding in Joseph's life. Dr. D. Marty Jones said it's a tragic thing when a person succeeds before they're ready for it. Something that we can encourage ourselves and our children and those that we influence to wait for that. Let God have his perfect work through faith and patience. And unfortunately, not one of our favorite, but it's one of the best. Also through tribulation, we learn how to possess the things that God gives us. Romans 5, 3 and 4 gives us a little insight on that because it builds character and hope, faith. I'll close with a little story. Well, I'll review real quick first. So first, when he was going through trying to avoid temptation, make your faith be known. Number 2, call sin for what it is. Number 3, remember God's there. Remember your relationship with God. Remember God. 4, stay busy. Not uselessly, but working hard for the Lord. Number 5, distance brings safety. 6, flee. 7, everyday determination. And 8, expect accusations, both from people and from the enemy. Joseph gives us that great example. So I want to close with a story. Remember Travis Hunt was sharing when he taught this chapter. There was an old man one time wanted to get rid of this old billy goat who was standing next to an old well, an old cistern. And so he decides, I'm going to get rid of that thing. I'm just going to bury that stupid thing. So he shoves it down in a well, grabs his shovel, and starts filling it up with dirt. Get rid of that stupid goat. Well, as he's getting close to being done, he looks kind of up to see his work, and all of a sudden, boop, goat jumps out. Gets mad, throws his shovel down. But all the goat had to do, every shovelful that came down, shake it off. And pretty soon you get higher and higher, and you're out of there. So as the temptations and the accusations and the tribulation of this life comes, a little dirt gets thrown on you, shake it off. It's going to be all right. Trust the Lord. Father, we thank you, Lord. I thank you, Lord. I was just so blessed by Joseph's life, increasingly. Lord, as I begin to see the value that I never appreciated as a younger man, the value in the principles that you've saved in his life, that we might learn from them. God, we're so thankful. Lord, may you raise up a new generation of Timothys and Joshuas. Lord, like Timothy, Lord, may we continually pray for the grandmothers and mothers who will teach their children the scriptures to raise up a young man that would affect the known world for the gospel of Jesus Christ. Lord, may we continually pray for those who are in difficult situations, physically, financially, just spiritually. Lord, you long to call them to this same relationship, this same strength, and this same blessing. God, we may take these principles, these things that you've put in our hearts, Lord, and help us get through the rest of this week, because, man, you know we need it. In Jesus' name, amen.